Hi, everyone. Katie Anderson here with another of my author interview series guests. And I'm so excited to have George Saiz here with me today to talk about his new book. We started with respect. So welcome, George. I'm so happy to have you here.
Oh, thank you, Katie. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so in a moment, I want you to introduce yourself, but I am so thrilled for your book to be coming out. And I've been part of the process, when you first were starting to write and then through the whole writing process. And so it's really thrilling to be here to support you with the book launch and to share it with the world. And I can share in a little bit the endorsement that I've written for the book, as well as some endorsements from other great people like Bob Chapman, the CEO of Barry Wehmiller. So welcome, George. And why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself and maybe how we got connected originally, and then we can dive into some questions.
Okay, sounds great. Well, I spent 40 plus years in the medical device industry, from cardiovascular to orthopedics, plastic surgery, biologics, quite a bit. And I started off in operations and worked my way up into executive management and got the opportunity to run some companies. Enjoyed that. And then at the, I think in about 2000, I was working for a company called DJO, and I got connected with AME, Association for Manufacturing Excellence. And so at the end, when I left my last company, I had an opportunity to go be the president CEO of AME for the last 3 years of my career. So it was really fun. A great opportunity to get around the world and see some wonderful, wonderful companies. And actually, that was how we met. Katie took over, started the Consortium in San Francisco, and while I was president of AME. And so that's how we met. And you guys do a great job with that, and AME is a great organization, but had a lot of fun writing the book based on a lot of the perspectives I've gained over all the years, plus all the time at AME and seeing all those great companies too.
Yeah, it's so great. So we'll start with one of my first questions, which is what inspired you to write a book, and this book in particular?
Well, I think to begin with, I've always been interested in culture. I think even back when I was first in leadership, I thought, you can have a plan, and a great plan looks good up on the wall, but if you don't have the right people in the right culture, it's hard to execute it. And I always thought that culture was the vehicle to execute those plans. And then if we fast forward many years later, when I was president of a medical device company, I was invited to an AME leadership summit on people-centric leadership and trying to ignite a manufacturing renaissance. And it was hosted by Bob Chapman, the CEO of Barry Wehmiller, as you spoke about. And he said two words there that really impacted me. The first one was the word intentional. And he talked about having an intentional plan for your culture. And I thought about it as president. I thought, we have, all of our leadership team was bought into respect and into teamwork. We had values that we spent a lot of time crafting and had those posted, but we really didn't have a plan to intentionally develop that culture. The values were there, but there wasn't, just like having a strategic plan aligns the organization, there wasn't that intentional plan that Bob talked about for developing the culture. So that was one word. And then the second one he used was the word entrusted. And he talked about that these lives, that the folks who report to you, their lives are entrusted to us as leaders. And I thought about that. I thought as president of the company, certainly that meant everybody in the company, but I thought that's an awesome responsibility to think about that what I say and what I do significantly impacts somebody's life, both at home and at work. And so I went to that meeting as a practitioner of people-centric leadership principles, but I left as a promoter. And I thought, I began really writing and speaking about it a lot more, and I became a lot more active. And certainly then when I joined AME, then my whole life was out promoting this. But so it was a natural for me then when I retired to write a book, and I love writing. I've enjoyed that always. And so writing it on culture and leadership seemed like a natural. Now, I will say the other part of that is I decided to write it as a business novel. So that added some complexity to it. I love the book, The Goal by Eli Goldratt, way back when. And I read a lot of business books, but I'm good at reading the first 6 to 8 chapters and not finishing them. And so when I read that one, though, I read the whole book because it was a story and I wanted to see what happened. And even I was in the midst of my first role as a division leader in a turnaround situation. And so my wife could read the book and understand what I was going through. So I had always thought if I wrote a book, I was going to write one as a business novel. And so this book is also in that business novel format, which, as you know, as a writer, I mean, it's challenging enough to write a book, but then you have the complexities of the story and characters and perspective and making sure how you line things up. Even all the little details. I had a little story where a guy played hooky one day and went off and went snow skiing. And my buddy that was reading the book for me as well along the way said, you have a guy going snow skiing in the middle of summer in Southern California? I thought, okay, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so I had to change it to surfing, but it was all those other little details that also come into it when you're writing the novel part of it.
Yeah, well, I'm so impressed with writing a novel. I mean, my book, Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn, is, stories and story driven. It was different complexity where I was trying to, I was capturing someone's real life story and trying to weave it together. But I think it's a whole different level of having to create characters and think about how this, you're really creating the whole situation where I'm figuring out how to retell and connect the dots on things. So kudos to you for creating an engaging story. And here's what Bob Chapman had to say about it. He says, you'll be drawn in by the compelling story that unfolds and energized by the lessons it reveals. If you're serious about transforming your team, your department, your organization, let We Started with Respect be your guidebook for improving your leadership and the precious lives in your span of care. What an awesome endorsement and a great sort of loop back to that inspiration from you about how to really create a people-centered culture as a leader.
Yeah. It's a great comment.
Yeah, it's good. So, George, what's one thing that you've learned personally about leadership in a different way through the process of writing this story or this book?
Well, I think one thing that I did learn was about, and I'd always practiced this, I think, but I'm not necessarily came up through the book as much as it's in the book and part of the book. And that was that as leaders, it's really easy to get trapped into trying to treat everybody equally. And I've realized in my career that it's not best to treat everybody equally. And the things that inspired me were things like taking a Myers-Briggs test, personality test, or the DISC profile, or even there's a book out, the five languages of appreciation in the workplace, of how people like to be appreciated, and realizing that what motivates and what rewards everybody is very different. And it's important to build those individual relationships and actually not treat everybody equally, because in so doing, you may not motivate or reward somebody in the way that works for them. And you've left with, sub-optimization, and really, and for that person, they're missing out on, the opportunity to be fulfilled at work.
Yeah, that's so powerful. And, to me, that ties back to one of the words that Bob shared and inspired you with, being intentional. So how do you be intentional about that and not just get trapped into, your habits and responding in one way, but really responding in the way that's going to help develop each individual person or be what they need as well.
Right. It's very important.
Yes.
And I think that shows respect as well for the individuals.
Yeah. So let's talk about it. We started with respect. That's the title of your book. And without giving all the stories away, let's talk about what does that title mean? And then the second question is, what are some of the key lessons or stories in addition to what you've shared that come out of that?
Well, the book is about, with my medical device background, it's about a medical device company that pioneered a new technology as a startup company. And then, they really worked more through brute force to get all those products out and get themselves sold. And now that they're sold, the holding, the people that were the principals all took off with their buyout packages and kind of left the company bare, and the products have aged out. And so the company that bought them want to get something going that there's still some brand equity in the name. And so they bring in a new president to turn it around and revive the company. And this gentleman believes in that culture is really that foundational system that'll help propel the company forward and sustain it in the future. And in his mind, the starting point, I leave off one chapter with, he knows exactly where to start, and that his starting point is to start with respect, and start with respect of the individual. And so in the book, we'll follow this. He reconstitutes the leadership team, gets new product development going, and they're off to the races. But they're in the process, they're rebuilding their culture from scratch. And so we follow the team as they go through that. But it starts, and he talks about that many times through the book, that years later we'll look back and see how respect was the center of everything we did, and he'll say later that it becomes the glue that holds it all together. And I really believe that that's very true, that you can have a great company, you can have a good or great company, but an extraordinary company is something where we're really treating people with respect and thinking about how we can fulfill and engage them each day.
What are some ways, without telling all the story too, that leaders can demonstrate respect, and maybe how that plays through some elements of your book?
Well, the first one I think is most important is listening to, well, not before you listen, ask folks what they think, what they'd like. In fact, when they talk about, and we talk about building the elements of a culture, I think there's many ways you can go about it. The CEO can say, this is how we're going to do it, based on either how I did it in the past or what I think is best, or maybe they want to control the environment. It could be you put together a small group of peers that are going to decide for everybody what our culture is going to look like and what those key elements will be. Or you could bring in outside consultants to decide and say, here's the latest thinking in culture. But I think the most respectful way and I think the most original way is to ask the employees what they think would be motivating and engaging in the elements of a culture that they want to come to work in each day. And if you ask them and then listen and use it, you've already got a great, support base for the kind of foundation that you're going to build. But I think that's where it starts, is asking your employees and then listening and using that input. And it's really, as I said, I think you're finding out then what's really going to work for them as well. And so you're already halfway home.
Yeah. Well, and it's so simple in concept, but often feels challenging to do. What are some of those challenges that you've experienced in your own career or observed in others that have been barriers to creating these cultures founded on respect?
Well, I think I can share that in the context of an aha moment that I had in writing the book. It didn't occur in writing, but it occurred after I wrote the book. As I wrote it, I sent it out once it was completed to 3 different beta groups of readers, so about 8 people in each group, and they gave me their feedback. And the interesting thing was that there's a gentleman that I worked with in the 1980s that said, "Wow, George, you wrote all about us." And then another guy that I worked with at a different company in the 1990s said, "You wrote all about our company, didn't you?" And somebody in the 2000s, another company, said the same thing. And then lastly, Dick Ryan, you may know Dick Ryan. He read the book, was one of my readers, and he said, I love the book, but he said, "I thought you told the story of the wire mold transformation." And what really hit me then was that we've had all this culture and leadership evolving, the approaches evolving. And if you think back to post-World War II, we were very much business-centric, and the leadership style was command and control. And then by the 1980s, we went to team ideas of quality circles and self-directed work teams. And then by the 2000 turn of the century, we went into servant leadership and people-centric leadership where everybody feels valued. And so we've been evolving in this culture approach all this time, and I think doing very good things. But what I realized from what those folks said to me was that the real issue and the real culprit isn't which one of those models you embrace. The real issue is that most people don't have an intentional culture. And that's what was missing at each one of those companies, was having any formalized approach. And if you don't have an intentional culture, going back to what Bob said, then we have a culture by default. And what that is it's based on whatever your supervisor wants to do. And then it's different depending on which door you open. And so, I recognize that when I was president of a company, I could espouse people-centric leadership principles, but the real culture for every employee was whatever their supervisor advocated and supported in practice. And if they supported a people-centric, then great. But if they were a tyrant, then the culture to that employee was tyrannical. I mean, that's what it was. And so that was my big aha in realizing that the biggest culprit is that most companies don't have that. They have a set of values, but they don't have a way to get those values and make them actionable and make them part of what they do on an everyday part of the business. It's not part of their strategic plan. We have those values, and we did at the company I was at when Bob said that. And that's what made me realize that, well, we don't have any way of putting those into work, into play in our business unless we have an intentional plan with actual tactics and measurables.
The word intention is one that's been really important to me for a while. And the way I see it, and this came from actually the Japanese symbols from the word intention. And it comes from the symbols of samurai and heart. So like the strength and then the sort of soul, heart, purpose. It's like, what's your purpose? And then direction. And I see that as, it's actually the compass symbol. And it's like, it's heart plus direction. And really, so you have to know what's your purpose and what's the impact you want to have. And then what actions are you going to take as an individual leader or as a collective leadership team or organization to create and fulfill that. And I see a lot of times we have this desire, we have this sense of the impact that we want, or to the values, we have this in here, but we're not necessarily manifesting it through taking the actions that are really aligned in that direction. And your book really shows how leaders can take those actions. So start with respect, but then how do you do that and actually create it?
Right. And I had read a lot of books where they had some really insightful ideas. And then I'd be left thinking, okay, well, what does that look like in real life? What do I do with it? And so that's what I wanted to put in this book through the novel part is you see the team actually then doing it. And it's meant to be descriptive, but not prescriptive. So here's how you could do this and a lot of great ideas and insights and what it would look like in a company. But it's not a book that's saying, there's only one way and this is it. But I think it gives you a great, as a matter of fact, on the front of the book, it says it's a novel with the word novel scratched out and then blueprint. So it is a story, but it is a blueprint, but it doesn't say that's the only way to do it, but it'll give you a really good idea of where to start and how to go about it.
And the reflection that you can have around, what did you learn from the story? That's the same, I had an aha moment when I was writing my book too, that I originally thought it would be different leadership lessons. And I realized actually that's the stories and the parables and the experiences, and then how we personally reflect on that's going to be more meaningful. And I think you really have created that successfully for others as well. So, talking about learning, how can people best learn from your book? What are some different ways that the book will support, or other way, the book will support people's learning and how an application?
Well, at the back of the book, there's a section called reflections. And so I have a list of questions that the reader or their team or their book club can go through at the end of each chapter. And it'll take them through some of the same situations that the team is going through in the book. And so that it'll ask them to take that situation and ask them, well, what does that look like in your company? How have you approached it? How would you approach it? Do you agree or disagree? And so it gives them, I think, an opportunity to say, well, yeah, that would work for us, or that wouldn't work for us, and here's why, but here's how we would approach it. But I think it would help them examine all those same situations about how to implement a transformational culture that would be based on respect.
Yeah. And you've told me as well that there might be a workbook that is involved as well. As how does that relate to the learning process?
Not yet. No workbook. So I was thinking about doing a workbook, and then decided to put the questions at the back of it and just give it away. So it's all part and parcel.
That's great. So basically the book is the workbook.
Yes.
That's
yes,
awesome.
yes.
So it's a one-stop shop for discovery and learning.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. You know, when you were writing the book, who did you consider your target audience?
Well, anybody in a leadership role or aspiring to be a leader, I would hope people that are thinking about it for the future would consider thoughtfully, how do I go about this, and what would that look like if I have that opportunity to be a leader? And then for those that are new in leadership or increasing in roles, even up to a CEO of a company, and they're looking for thinking about culture. Um, one thing that I thought about also in writing the book is how we how people become leaders. How do we appoint leaders? And typically, in most companies, I think, and tell me if this resonates with you, the person that's best at the functional role becomes the leader. So the person that sells the most becomes the sales manager. The person that produces the fastest with highest, best quality becomes the lead or the production supervisor. And we're always hoping that those folks will be able to replicate their success and teach others how to do it that way. But because they're great at their functional role doesn't necessarily mean they're a great leader, and they haven't been trained to be leaders. And so I think that that's a big miss for us. And in terms of hopefully this book might fill in some of that gap, is that if you're going to become a leader, you need to think about what you're going to do. And I hope companies will look at this more seriously as well and think about how they can equip their leaders to, in fact, lead and to motivate folks. And I know that some of the folks that I'm talking to that are planning, that are in leadership or in training roles, are planning to use this book as part of their curriculum to help train leaders. And I think that's a very thoughtful way to go about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And how that they can have that conversation together about what does this mean for not just us as individuals, but as a company, and to do what the very thing that you set out, which is, how do you ask those questions and listen and hear and align those behaviors?
Well, one of the elements in the book that the team decides upon is 100% leadership buy-in to 100% of the plan. And when you think about that, some folks may think, well, that seems impossible to get all of your leaders aligned to the same approach and to the same plan. But again, if you don't, then you have a system that's being undermined constantly. And I think it's imperative and important. And so this is a tool that could help companies do that. They could take their leadership teams and look at this approach and then talk about, well, what would this mean to us and how would we approach it in a way that we do it where we're all doing the same way. For all of us that are in lean, I mean, we approach production with what? Standard work. And we expect everybody to do it the same way. And if you want to make it better, great, let's test it out. And then if it works, then we'll change it and everybody will do it the same way. Well, leadership should be the very same thing. We should have that same alignment throughout our culture and our leadership approach and the way that we treat folks. And so I think it's just really important. And the numbers that support this are overwhelming in terms of the outcomes within companies, whether it be return on investment to all of the other, net profit to productivity and quality. Everything is enhanced when you have that type of alignment and engagement.
Absolutely. I've been reflecting on my recent trip to Japan, and all these companies we're visiting. One of the uniting things is they didn't consider their purpose to necessarily be the product or service. So, of course, what's important was about looking at people. So Toyota focuses on, we make people so that we can make cars. Their purpose is joy or happiness or people's development. And it just is a different is like a different shift in that connecting with something more meaningful about that respect. Maybe it's their way of saying we start with respect for people first, and then we can do all those other things that we need to do as an organization.
Right. Once you have that foundation in place, it's amazing what folks will do. It's just, I talk about it in the book as being the difference between being committed and compliant. And, when folks are engaged, they're committed, and what they'll do for a company and for each other is amazing. And when they're not and they're compliant, you're dragging everything along, trying to make it happen, but it just doesn't seem to mesh.
No, you can't really create continuous improvement in that situation either. It's just I'm just showing up to do a job, and Yep. That connecting to that purpose is so important. So I want
Right.
to shift gears a little bit because a lot of our conversations offline have been about writing and publishing and the writing process. And before we started recording, we were sharing some key takeaways that you've had recently. But if you look back on this whole journey from once you really got started with writing the book, what's one lesson that's really standing out for you that maybe you didn't expect to learn, or that's just been really has really changed your perspective?
Whoa, boy, there's a lot of things I've learned. I'll say one thing that hit me right away was, if you're going to write a book, you better grow some thick skin, because everyone's going to poke at it, and what makes sense to you doesn't always convey to everybody else. So every chapter I finished, my first reader was my wife, and she's an avid reader of novels. And for her, a novel has to play like a movie. So it's constantly moving, constantly playing in her mind. And if the movie ever stops, then it's not good. And so she would read it and she would be brutally honest. Well, it was boring here, or this, it stopped here, or this didn't make sense. And then my buddy that was also reading it was doing some of the same things. And so I realized, okay, you're going to have to grow some thick skin through this process, because you've read it, you think it sounds great, and they're saying this is boring or this doesn't make sense. And so then, as I started working my way through it, it just became very comfortable with, okay, I'm going to do my best, and then you guys give me the feedback, and it's going to get better. And then when I sent it out to the beta readers, they did some of the same things. And I have to say, by doing that, it's amazing. I think the book was so much better because of the input that I got, and then was able to listen. Even up, maybe just digress for a second. There was one gentleman, Craig Williams, who was one of my readers, that said, I think you need to have more on there in change management. And the more I researched it, I knew about change management, but the more I researched, the more I learned myself, and the more I realized how important it was. And I actually added an entire chapter about change management based on his recommendation. So it made it a much more viable read, I think, and insightful. But it was because, I guess because I listened. I'm not trying to give too much credit, but it was not having that skin that said, hey, I'm the one that knows, I'm writing, and you listen. It was we're writing this together, and let's get these good thoughts together and share it with everybody. And so all the input was really, really, really welcomed.
That's great. And writing is it's a process of revision and input. And as I shared with you, there has to be a certain point where you're like, okay, we're going to stop and we're just going to go forward with it right now. I really appreciate what you shared there. And I think there's I'm thinking of a linkage with leadership too. I was, recently with a client, and there was some surprise from the leadership team that the frontline didn't really understand the strategic direction or priorities of the organization. And I think it's because we get, we're the writers, we don't realize how is it connecting or how is it translating. So to be able to have those conversations and hear that feedback and then think, oh, what do we need to do differently to make that connect or be more clear, or the parts that are missing, is such a important leadership skill as well. And certainly for a writer too.
Right. It's it doesn't matter. I mean, if we think they should understand it, but they don't, it doesn't matter. There's a gap. And if you don't close that gap, then you'll suffer the consequences of having a gap. And so it's worth it to say, okay, well then what do I have to do to make that connection? That's what we want. We want that connection throughout our organization, at all levels.
Absolutely. So one of my usual wrapping up questions is, what's a question that I have not asked you about the book that you would like to answer? And what is that question? And what's your answer?
Oh, you didn't tell me about that question.
It's a surprise, or a topic, just.
Oh gosh. Yeah, I think you've covered so much of you've given me a great platform here to tell about the book. When's it going to be out?
Oh, that's a great question. We didn't cover that. So George, when is We Started with Respect coming out into the world?
It's going to be released on July 11th. So coming up very quickly, or just happened, depending when you get to watch this. But July 11th is the release date, and been about a 2.5-year process. So really looking forward to that.
That's super exciting. That's about the same for me. It's a long process. So those of you thinking about writing a book, just be prepared. Be prepared.
Yeah.
So July 11th, 2023. That's actually the same week as my book's birthday. So we can celebrate together.
Cool. Yeah.
And that's super great. And where can people get the book or pre-order the book or purchase it, and in what formats is it available?
So it's available in ebook and softcover and hardcover, and you can get it through all the traditional outlets, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, certainly. If you want to go to my website, it's www.georgesaiz.com. Probably have my spelling on your as you publish this. And so my website has all kinds of it has a link that you can either pre-order or order it. And it also has a lot of articles and interviews that you can check out, and all the endorsements and whatnot on the book too.
Awesome. Well, so exciting, George. I'm really thrilled that your book's coming out, and I know it's going to have a tremendous impact for everyone. So thank you for coming on to my show to talk about the book and spread the word how everyone can start with respect. So,
thank you. Appreciate it, Katie.
Thanks again, everyone, for listening or reading. You can find us on YouTube, on the podcast channel, and on my blog, kbjanderson.com. And be sure to follow for more author interviews and opportunities. So thank you so much. And a special thing for those of you listening the week that this interview gets released, George is giving away 3 signed copies to readers in the United States. So thank you, George. That's super exciting. Sign up look below, or the links associated with how you can register for that. So 3 copies of George's book signed that he's giving away the first week of this interview's release. So congratulations again, George, on the release of your book. And I know it's going to have a tremendous impact.
Thank you, Katie. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.